So it's been a breathless year. So much so that my therapist swore that I wasn't the only one who's been coming in week after week, heart racing and head spinning from one executive order to the next, which means it wasn't only for me that he coined the term executive order disorder this spring. Many of us have come in and shared that you felt stuck in a kind of permanent reactive mode, suffering from a daily whiplash in our country. You've talked to me about increased anxiety and depression and worry. We're impatient now. We're fighting with our families. We're forgetting to eat, but we're gaining weight anyway. The daily assault on what we know to be just and right has left us with an overwhelming sense not only of incredulity, but of fragility. And if only this was all that we had to contend with. Looking around the room, I know that there are many people in here tonight who are holding grief. A parent who lived long but suffered too much at the end. A spouse who didn't wake up in the morning. A child. Many of us have loved ones who are not well and will not get better. Some of us come here tonight holding heartache because of a sibling bond that is irrevocably broken. Some of us fear growing old. Some of us fear failure. Some of us fear how we're going to pay the bills. Some in this room are desperately trying to get pregnant, and some are desperately trying to hold together the fraying edges of our marriage. At least a few in this room I know are holding a breakup after decades of building a life together. Some are being stuck in this moment between aging parents and struggling children. Some are struggling ourselves, struggling about turning 50. Some are struggling about turning 30. Some of us have that pain in the left leg that makes it hard to walk. And some of us have those migraines that make it hard to do anything. We worry for our parents and for our children and for our hearts. And all of this is on top of those Twitter tirades that just won't stop. The children of Israel were brutally enslaved in Egypt for more than 200 years. When Moses came and signaled that liberation was near, "It's our time," he said. "God will free us from bondage and bring us home." But the people couldn't hear, "Velo sham'u el Moshe." Why? Mikotzer ruach u'me'avodah kasha, because of shortness of breath and hard work. Know this, what Moses was promising was exactly what the people had been praying for hundreds of years. But when that news finally came, the situation was so bad that they actually could not hear it. And this, we know, happens. Whether the foundation of our lives is shaken by a political reality or by a personal one, we, like the children of Israel, suffer from shortness of breath that makes it hard for us to hear, let alone think or process effectively. That's where many of us are this year as we approach High Holy Days, suffering from a shortness of breath. So the question is, how do we get our breath back? I have spent a lot of time over the past year arguing against the dumbing and the numbing of American religious life. We have come to see the banner of God and religion waved in ways that range from the absurd to the obscene, justifying cruel and regressive politics and policies, making a mockery of the very religious traditions that they claim to celebrate. My focus has been twofold. On one hand, religious extremism, the exploitation of sacred texts to justify hatred and violence in God's name. On the other hand, what I call religious routinism, which is rote and soulless, empty religiosity, reflecting a widespread decay in the religious system. These countervailing trends are profoundly alienating, especially to a generation that considers itself spiritual but not religious, and therefore can't flee the religious establishment quickly enough. Religion today has failed to capture the imagination of millions of people who are repelled by the viciousness of extremism and disenchanted by the dullness of routinism. They refuse to choose between a religion that is deadly and a religion that is dead. But this past year, yet another trend has emerged in the bleak landscape of American religious life: religious escapism. This now dominant trend is religion as a pacifier, religion as a diversion. This is thoughts and prayers religion, as in our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of the hurricane, while we sit on our hands and lock our doors and shame anyone who dares to bring up how increased ocean temperatures so clearly contributed to the intensity and to the relentlessness of these storms. We're deeply saddened about the school shooting, about the hate crime, about the Nazi march, about the natural disaster, but let's not politicize a tragedy now. Come on. Religious escapists worship at the altar of the status quo, and they have had quite a revival in America over the past year. When Marx called religion the opium of the people, he was criticizing religion that quiets the oppressed masses. I wonder what he would think of religion that quiets the privileged masses. It turns out that there's more than one opioid addiction in this country. This one requires no needle and no prescription, just a church or synagogue membership and a willingness to use religion as a drug to quiet our human instincts, to help us escape reality. But religion was never intended to be an escape or an opiate, to dull our senses, but rather it was intended to be an oxygen, the fuel that we need to breathe in breathless times. So how is it that religious practice can help us not escape the challenges of the day, but instead give us the strength to confront and to move through them? If you've spent any time in this community, you may have heard me share the story about an early encounter between Avram, before he became Avraham, and God. The question that the rabbis are trying to answer is, why was Avram chosen by God to leave his homeland, his family, everything he knew, and go out to this strange and foreign place? And so the rabbis tell us in a midrash, a kind of parable. The story is of a traveler who's en route from one place to another when he sees a birah doleket, a palace that's consumed in flames. And he stops and he asks, how can it be that this palace is burning and nobody's taking care of it? Who's the manhig? Who is the caretaker who's responsible for this place? And at that moment, the owner pokes his head out of the burning home and says, I am the owner of this place. So too the Midrash says that Abraham was walking through the world and he saw that the whole place was on fire. And he asks, how can it be that the world burns without somebody trying to save it? Who's responsible here? Who's the manhig? Who is the caretaker of this place? And God responds by saying, Avram, I am the owner of this place. I love everything about this story. I love that despite his busy life and abundant blessings, this person looks up and sees that something is on fire. I love that he's a traveler. He's out of place. He's on the move. He has somewhere to go. This is a person with plausible deniability. He could easily argue that this burning palace is not his problem, but he does not. He stops and he asks. I love that this man works on the moral assumption that someone must be responsible, and he demands to know who. And did you notice? It's his question that forces the owner out of his own complacency, that wills that owner out of disregard for his creation. I love that the question the traveler asks is, who is the caretaker? And the answer that he's given is, I am the owner, meaning you who notice that my house is on fire, you are now the caretaker. This is the Jewish origin story. The world is burning, and Abraham notices, and so he asks God, what are you doing about it? And God turns back to Abraham and says, well, what are you doing about it? And then together they get up and they go to put out a fire. What does it mean for us to be descendants of Abraham? Our spiritual inheritance is to be awake, to see, and lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, to be pursuers of justice and righteousness, eternal good guys, the vigilant ones, the Justice League, the your struggle is my problem people. We are intended to be the fighters and the defenders and the bearers of holy chutzpah. So the first thing we need to know in these breathless times is that we must not be fazed or disheartened by these fires. There have always been, and there will always be, palace fires. Our most ancient spiritual calling is to be awake to them, to see them. It's in our DNA. Wakefulness, willful opposition, restless agitation. This isn't thin, knee-jerk liberalism. This is the great Jewish legacy woven through biblical and rabbinic narratives over 4,000 years, prodding us to live lives of courage and conviction. Because as much as Judaism is about obedience to God and observance of mitzvot, the central moments of Israelite and Jewish history are all characterized by defiance against unjust power structures. Our heroes are those who stood up for the vulnerable, who risked everything to fight for what was just and what was right, like Avraham. That is what gives our life's purpose. But it can also, as we know from experience, take our breath away. So back to the burning palace, Bira doleket. There's a powerful ambiguity that is built into this text that allows us to read it not only as a palace on fire, but as a palace that's radiant with light, as in hadlakat nerot. Okay, so then what then would the story teach us? A traveler's on his way, and he looks up and he sees a magnificent palace, a work of art that's radiating beauty, and it stops him in his tracks. And he asks, how can it be? How can it be that so much beauty exists in the world? Who is responsible for this place? And just then the owner appears and says, thank you. Thank you for noticing my creation. Come, let us work together to care for this place. Who then is Avraham? Avraham is one who sees beauty when others around him are too busy and too distracted to notice. Avraham is the one who stops in awe and wonder. And I don't mean here beauty as in glamour or luxury. I mean beauty the way the Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donohue spoke about beauty. Beauty that ennobles the heart and reminds us of the infinity that is within us. A sense of emerging fullness, of grace and elegance, a deeper sense of depth. That's why, he said, I find the aesthetic things like poetry and fiction and good film and theater and drama and dance and music actually awaken that inside of you and remind you that there is a huge interiority within you. I wonder how many of us in this room remember this year that there is a huge interiority within us. I want to ask you to think about the last time that you experienced something truly awesome. Most of us access awe in nature, gazing at an expanse. When I was flying home from DC in July, I caught the famed 4-hour sunset. This is when the plane is miraculously and blessedly paced with the setting sun. And I was lucky enough to have a window seat, which I thought was clearly God's way of thanking me for sitting handcuffed for 5 hours in the Capitol Police Station, protesting the Senate's attempt to strip health care from this country's most vulnerable citizens. I wept that entire plane ride, so swept up in the magnificence of God's creation. When we see something that beautiful, we call it breathtaking, but really we should call it breath-giving. Because when the vicissitudes of life constrict the heart, it's awe that stretches it back out, that makes us more compassionate and more loving and more present. A couple of years ago, some University of California psychologists did a study in which they proved just that. They said that the experience of awe, which they define as that sense of wonder that we feel in the presence of something vast that transcends our understanding of the world, The experience of awe actually promotes altruism, love, and compassionate behavior. So here's how it works. When we think we're alone in the world, it's all on us, we despair. We suffer from kotzer ruach, from a kind of shortness of breath. Those psychologists didn't say that. I did. Kotzer ruach is really a shortness of spirit. It's anguish, like the children of Israel when Moses first appeared to them. They can't hold it all. But when we stand in shared astonishment, like at the sight of the eclipse, or in the heart-pumping ecstasy that comes when you reach a perfect harmony, or in the euphoria of V'yatayu in Musaf, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, stick around tomorrow, or in a shared sense of purpose, like at a mass protest where there were 1 million people in Washington, D.C. the day after the inauguration. That experience of awe is what gives us our breath back, reminding us that we're part of something that is bigger than any one of us. Awe, that study found, causes people to become more invested in the greater good, give more to charity, volunteer more to help other people. Awe and wonder. Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the profound and perpetual awareness of the wonder of being is one of the goals of the Jewish way of living, to experience commonplace deeds as spiritual adventures, to feel the hidden love and wisdom in all things. Micha mocha ba'ilim Adonai, micha mocha nadar ba'kodesh, norat tehilot osef fela. Who is like you, God, working wonders in the world? So which one is it? Is the palace burning down, or is that palace radiant with light? It's clearly both. If all you see when you look out at the world is danger and fire, you desperately need to rediscover the beauty. And if all you see is endless beauty, you desperately need to be reminded that there's a hell of a lot of brokenness out there that needs fixing. Wonder and heartache, appreciation, agitation, the challenge of the religious life is to figure out how to hold all of that at once. Which brings me back to the religious quackery of escapism. Because the goal of the religious life is not to escape the world as it is, but to be awake to it, its bruises, its fires, its brokenness. And it's also to breathe hope and life and love and possibility back into that broken world once we've gotten a glimpse of the wondrous and the beautiful and the magnificent, to help usher in the world that could be. There's loss, and there is love. There's grief, and there's also grandeur. There's pain, and there's also possibility. Scott's beloved mother died a couple of weeks ago, just when Scott was hunkered down in a concrete shelter in Fort Myers, Florida, so that he could get footage of Hurricane Irma. That night, in his grief, Scott texted me just after losing power. "We're right in the eye of the storm," he said. "There's something incredibly impressive about it, the power of it. There are only a precious few sensitive souls in the world who can hold the realization of magnificence while actually braving the night in the burning palace." A few days later, Scott returned home and sat Shiva. The place was packed with you, people who show up at the Shiva. And I explained that Scott literally had just come from the eye of the storm, and our job was to give him his breath back. And then I started a little nigun. And without a word, you, with your love, stood up and stepped close and put your arms around Scott and around Sipra and around one another, and you sang the breath right back into him. You saw Sammy, my daughter, on Rosh Hashanah, blow her shofar with her safta. I want to tell you 2 little stories about my other 2. When Eva was little, because she was a first child and I was a guilt-ridden working mom, I kept a careful log tracking every sweet, funny, goofy, moving thing that she said. Like when she asked me one day, Ima, is God dead? And I was a little surprised, and I said, what makes you ask that, love? And she said, well, I know he's very old, and I haven't seen him in a long time, so I thought he might be dead, like Pa Sam. And I was just wondering who told her that God was a he. So just before Rosh Hashanah, when Eva was 3 years old, I got some sad news about a terrible loss that happened in the community. And I was desperately trying to hold back tears as Eva and I walked outside to the car. My heart was so heavy, and it was dark and it was gloomy outside, and there was a thick layer of ominous cloud, which felt oddly appropriate. But then Eva proclaimed, Ima, look, look, the sky is so pretty and blue. I said, with a giant knot in my throat, the sky's dark gray. No, Ima, it's blue, she said. And I was slightly annoyed and also slightly concerned that she might be colorblind. But she pointed up to the corner of the sky where, in fact, there was a tiny patch of bright, beautiful blue peeking out from the dark clouds. She was right. The sky was blue. I was just so caught up in the gray that I didn't even notice. So cut to 10 years later, a couple of weeks ago, when I'm on my way to shul with Levi, who's now 8, and he says he has a question, but he doesn't want to hurt my feelings. And then he finally bursts out, Ima, every day we're talking about all the bad news. When do we get to talk about the good news? I shared these two stories when we were together at the beach on Sunday at Tashlich, and I asked you, what's the good news? We all know about the dark clouds hovering over our country right now. Where is the small patch of blue? And I collected cards with your answers on them, and Carol turned them into this beautiful prayer wall, which I hope some of you will spend a few moments meditating by and reflecting at. Here's what I noticed when I looked at hundreds of your answers. Levi's right. We spend a lot of time these days talking about how the palace is burning. Every hour, every alert on our phones is another devastating surprise. But the truth is, there's also a lot of good news out there. There's a lot of beauty, and there's a lot of wonder. And most of what you wrote, maybe more than 80% of the cards that we got, was about one particular brand of radiant light that's pouring forth from the palace. See if you can catch the common theme here. My family loves me. My cousins love me. I have my health, poo, 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 and I have love in my life. Soul friends have become family. Rachie and Jeremiah. Becca and Rabbi Nate. Loving family. Loving friends. Holding on to the belief that I will find my beshert one day. Secure love. Secret love. Making love, which nobody wrote, but I'm assuming at least some of you meant to write. Making music, I love. Working with people, I love. Waking up next to my soulmate. Being home, surrounded by love. Finding a community of loving friends who give me warm hugs, deep laughs, and faith in humanity. After many years, finding the love of my life. Seeing love and humanity amidst the resistance to evil. And the very best thing ever that I like is my mommy. And more and more and more. You wrote about your love of travel, your love of music, your love of cats, your love of recreational marijuana, and even your love of the Columbia College football team. My good news is the love that people in this community show to one another every single day. So here's what I realized. That love is the good news. That love is the palace that's radiant with light. That love is what gives us our breath back. And my friend Valerie Kaur, a Sikh American civil rights activist who's right here with us tonight, spoke at midnight mass at the Metropolitan AME Church in DC on New Year's Eve. Many of you heard and read her words. We have seen darkness before, she said. And the mother in me asks, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that's waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What does the midwife tell us to do? Valerie asks, breathe and then push. Because if we don't push, we will die. If we don't push, our nation will die. So tonight we breathe, and tomorrow we labor in love. It's important that we know, and I think Valerie would agree, that this is not the love of oozing sentimentality. This is the love that is the driving force of social movements around the world. This is the stuff of poets and parents and prophets, those who understand love to be, as Valerie says, an inexhaustible wellspring that can inspire and embolden us to rise up with a courage that we did not know we had. Despite the intoxicating pull of escapist religion, the heart of our tradition doesn't want us to be comfortable with the world as it is. It is a rebellion against that world. The goal is not to be quieted. The goal is not to feel good, to get comfortable, to be settled while the whole palace burns. The goal is to be awake and to fight with love for the courage that we need, for the family that we yearn for the community that we are called to be, for the world that we want our children to inherit. Wonder and indignation, appreciation and agitation. There's good reason for our breathlessness. We are holding a lot right now, maybe too much. But I know this, we cannot sustain the battles of our lives with kotzer ruach, with shrunken spirits. And all around us, there's evidence of a new dawn rising. But it's up to us to ensure the triumph of love over hatred. We have to let the light in. It's ahava rabbah, the big love of a new day. And it's ahavat olam, the eternal love that sustains us through the dark of night, that can lift us up from our despair and our worry and our fear, offering us another way. Tonight, I remember the words of Antoine Liris, who took back his own breath after terrorists murdered his beloved wife in the Bataclan in Paris 2 years ago. On Friday evening, he wrote, "You stole the life of an exceptional person, the love of my life, the mother of my son, but you will not have my hatred. No, I will not give you the satisfaction of hating you. You want it, but to respond to hatred with anger would be to give in to the same ignorance that made you who you are. You would like for me to be scared, for me to look at my fellow citizens with a suspicious eye, for me to sacrifice my liberty for my security, but you have lost. I saw her this morning, at last, after nights and days of waiting. She was as beautiful as when she left on Friday evening, as beautiful as when I fell head over heels in love with her more than 12 years ago. Of course, I'm devastated with grief. I grant you this small victory, but it will be short-lived. I know that she will be with us every day, and we will find one another again in the heaven for free souls to which you will never have access. Us two, my son and I, will be stronger than every army in the world. I cannot waste any more time on you, as I must go back now to our son who has just woken from his nap. He's only 17 months old. He's going to eat his snack, just like every other day. And then we're going to play, just like every other day. And all his life, this little boy will be happy and he will be free, because you will never have his love, his hatred either. He chose love, and we too can choose the breath-giving life force of love. When we predicate our lives on wakefulness and wonder, when we show up at the Shiva, when we make holy music together in here and then raise holy hell together out there, when we see sacred text as art, when we train our eyes to see through the lens of gratitude first, well, we make room for breath, even in the most breathless moments. We reveal that we are still who we are, even still. So I want to ask you to do something with me now. I want to ask you to please stand up. And you got one of these sheets when you came in. I want to close tonight with the words of Reverend Lynn Unger, "I need you to breathe." And I want to ask all of you to say the words that we see in bold. And let us give each other our breath back.
Breathe,
said the wind. How can I breathe at a time like this, when the air is full of the smoke of burning tires and burning lives?
Just breathe.
The wind insisted. Easy for you to say, if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air.
I need you to breathe. I need you to breathe.
Don't tell me to be calm when there's so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair.
I didn't say to be calm,
said the wind.
I said to breathe. We're going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together.
There are hurricanes that bring death and destruction, and there are hurricanes that herald a new day, a day that's free of the pain that plagues us, that's free of the cruelties and the system failures that bind us, hurricanes that are driven by love and by breath, that usher in the winds of change and possibility, that remind us that each and every one of us was put here to bring light and love into the world. We don't need to escape. We need to remember how to breathe. As Mother Teresa taught us, we have been created for greater things, not just to be a number in the world, not just to go for diplomas or degrees for this work or that work. We have been created in order to love and to be loved. And that, my friends, is the good news. So let's breathe.